This series was supposed to start last week. Discipleship 101. When you go to college, you register for your first courses. Their course number's 101. You know what that means? That means you're the dum-dums. Discipleship 101 today, who is the greatest? We just finished the Olympics. Last week it was more current than today, but we just finished the Olympics. And that is 2 weeks of time devoted to the question, who is the greatest? Who is the greatest at what? Actually, I have begun rehearsing 4 years from now, the next Olympics. Yes, I'm getting ready for the next Olympics in Rio. Let me show you and see how I'm doing. I've begun a rehearsal. I'm already getting ready for the Olympics in Rio. See if it works. How are we doing? Do I have a chance? I mean, I've got the pose. Usain Bolt, fastest man in the world. I don't know, probably the fastest man ever, although how do we know that for certain? But he has run the 100 meters faster than anybody had ever run them before. It looks like a locomotive running down the track with a bunch of kids on tricycles. When it's just astonishing to watch him. Watch him go. Michael Phelps. Michael Phelps, the greatest swimmer. What was it? 18 gold medals and 22 medals overall, I think was the number. Something like that. Who can keep track? He's the greatest. Or how about Katie Ledecky? She's one of our own. Sophomore in high school, right here in our own area, winning that most difficult of all swimming races. Who is the greatest? Well, Katie, she must be the greatest. Or how about the USA women's soccer team? Let's hear it for the women's soccer team. Certainly didn't hear much from the men's soccer team, but who is the greatest? Actually, the issue of who is the greatest came up many years ago when most of you wouldn't even remember when a young boxer by the name of Cassius Clay. How many of you recognize the name of Cassius Clay? Well, there's a lot of old people here, right? Changed over to Muhammad Ali. How many recognize that name? Oh, yeah. Yeah, we did a lot better on that, didn't we? Changed his name. And he came out with that brash statement, I am the greatest. Well, who's going to argue with him? The greatest at what? The greatest at knocking the daylights out of anybody that you come up to? I guess that's a greatness. I am the greatest. But how passing, how transitory that is. And my heart aches when I see Muhammad Ali now shuffling with trembling hands anywhere he goes. Greatness, as we calculate it, is a very transitory and limited thing. What is greatness? What are you the greatest at? Synchronized swimming? Excuse me. I shouldn't have. But that's not one that I really rush to watch. Who is the greatest? It's a question that the disciples bring to Jesus. Now, we have an unfortunate problem with the word disciple. We have loaded this word up with all kinds of meanings that are not part of the meaning. The word disciple derives from the same source as the word discipline. Well, discipline is not a very pleasant word to us because we have loaded the meaning of discipline up to the place that we have equated it with punishment. We say, well, someone needs to be under discipline. Well, somehow we think that means they're being punished for something. Parents need to discipline their children. We've confused that with punishment. Discipline is not punishment. Discipleship is not a negative. Again, we have confused the word disciple. When we talk about disciple, we think of 12 men. Well, the facts are that in Scripture, there were a whole lot more people than the 12, and a lot of them, by the way, were women, some of them that had lots of money, who helped fund Jesus' mission. One of them, Mary Magdalene, became the first apostle. Did you know that? Mary, who rushed to the tomb, and what did Jesus say? He said, go and tell the disciples and the others. You know what apostle means? Apostello means one sent. So I ask you, who is the first person sent with the message of the resurrection? It's Mary. She's the first one sent. So we have loaded words up with things that make it hard for us to understand what it is we're actually saying or thinking. So we're going to do a three-part series on Discipleship 101. Today, who is the greatest? And if you want to follow along, Matthew, the 18th chapter. Some of you have printed page. Some of you have electronic scripture. Whatever you have, if you wish to follow along. Matthew, the 18th chapter. At that time, the disciples, what are disciples? People who are being trained in something. People who are learning something. People who are practicing something to get better at it. Olympic athletes are great disciples of their specific area. They are under a discipline that is more rigid than any of us can imagine. And even though I'm working on the pointing, I don't think I'll be in the race. I don't have what it takes at this point. You have to be under a discipline. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Unfortunately, disciples are a thick-headed bunch of people. That's why they're disciples. They're learning. And they are asking the question in their own context. And the problem for the disciples is that they have preconceived notions about the outcome, and they don't know what the outcome is going to be. So now when you read this story, you have the opposite problem. You know what the outcome is, so you have a hard time understanding what the story says. So I'm going to ask you to try, now this is an impossibility, but I'm going to ask you to try to abandon your knowledge of the end of the story. Okay? Now you can't really do that, can you? But you can try. You can look at it and say, if I didn't know the outcome, where would I be? The disciples don't know the outcome, so they ask a question in the context of their lack of information, their humanness. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now, let me give you a key word for the chapter of Matthew 18. Matthew 18 is what is known as hyperbole. We tend to read the scripture in a very literalistic and authoritarian style. Don't do that in Matthew 18. Matthew 18 is hyperbole. You remember what hyperbole is? You probably studied that somewhere in school. The parts of speech, what was there? Simile, alliteration, hyperbole, onomatopoeia. I always like to say that. It makes me sound so smart, you know. Onomatopoeia. I don't even remember for sure what it was, but I was learned to say it. Don't ask me to spell it. This is hyperbole chapter. Now I'm going to demonstrate that to you as we go through this. He called a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. What? Particularly in that setting, this was a strange thing to say. We have a little more care for children. I was very pleased this morning to look at our worship bulletin, and it says, children are the most impressionable people of our community. Picture of a child on the front. This is great. Let's not just make it a picture and a statement. Let's go after it, that the children are the most impressionable, maybe the most important people here. So let's work on that. Fortunately, you're not like the disciples on this point. In that setting, children and women both lived in a patriarchal society in which the men dominated the society, and they had really very little or no care for people who were not part of their dominant group. Authoritarian, domineering. And Jesus brings a child up who in that society was basically unimportant, maybe worthless. And he says, except you become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And he who welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me. Hyperbole. What does it mean? Become like little children? I don't know how old this child was. I suppose this child was about half the height of the disciples. That make sense? Okay, that means that you all have to shrink down to half size. No, that doesn't make any sense. It means you have to forget what you have learned. You can no longer do higher mathematics because little children don't know that. No, that doesn't make any sense. So don't try and make nonsense out of what Jesus says. What was he getting at? I think the best way I can illustrate it was when my second grandson was, about 2 or thereabouts. I was working at the General Conference with the assignment of conveying the message regarding the David Koresh Waco issue for the World Church. I was the one who was in charge of communicating for the church on that issue. And in the process, I became involved in news media, and Good Morning America made contact and asked me to come on Good Morning America and talk about the issue. So I did that. And all my family was gathered around the television set, my wife, my daughter, my son-in-law, and his 2 sons, the littlest one being about 2 years old at that time. And when I came on Good Morning America, all the family got very excited. And they said, Tucker, who was running around the room not paying much attention, Tucker, look, who's that on TV? And he looked over and he said, Grandpa. Because they have a video camera. They take lots of videos of all of the family, and Grandpa is in the videos every now and then. So what's the big deal? So Grandpa's on TV. I've seen him there before. The issue was that they were all impressed with Good Morning America and all of the significance that that's supposed to be. But Tucker was completely unimpressed by Good Morning America. It was just another picture of Grandpa on the television. Except you humble yourselves. Do you get the point? Except you humble yourselves and become like little children, forgetting all of this artificial question of who is the greatest. You will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, that doesn't mean to be disrespectful. Doesn't mean to rise to service at whatever level we can. What it means is that disciples need to abandon their artificial notions of what greatness is and realize that greatness comes in humility of everyone before the presence of God. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Disciples are kind of thick-headed. How many disciples do we have here today? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Kind of a thick-headed bunch, aren't they? But if anyone causes one of these little ones, verse 6, who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. What? What is Jesus advocating here? Well, let's go on. It gets even worse. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to sin. Such things must come, but woe to the man through whom they come. If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Whoa, come on. Now, if you want to read things literally, realistically, authoritarianly, that's what it says. Deal with it. That's what it says. But if you want to understand what it says in its hyperbole, what Jesus is advocating here is not bodily mutilation. What he is saying is, why would you do things that would be even worse than cutting off your hand or foot? That's hyperbole, disciples. Jesus is not advocating some ridiculous behavior. He is saying you are doing things that are even more devastating, even more foolish, even more ridiculous than cutting off your hand or your foot. Why would you do that? It goes on. It is better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. Well, yeah, I guess that does make sense, doesn't it? And if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. Oh, come on. This is even more gross, isn't it? If your eye causes you to sin, let me ask you a question. Don't raise your hand. How many of us have been caused to sin with our eyes? Pretty serious, isn't it? And if we followed this thing slavishly literal, would we have any Christians who had 2 eyes? No. But the hyperbole of the text is this. As absolutely absurd as it is to gouge out your eye and throw it away, why do you do things that are more destructive to you even than that? It's hyperbole. But hyperbole that makes a stunning point. See that you do not look down on one of these little ones, for I tell you, their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. The angels of the little ones are in the presence of God's face. But skipping down, can't take time for all of the chapter. Jesus talks about dealing with someone who sins against you. And Peter has caught on to the hyperbole bit. Oh, Peter, he's catching on. He's sharp. So he says, Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times. Peter thinks he's really laid one out there that's going to be significant. Up to 7 times. 7 was the perfect number. I don't know why 7 was the perfect number. They had favorite numbers like that. We don't do that much. 7 was the perfect number. 6 was the bad number. You know how that goes. What about 13? Well, I guess we aren't a whole lot better, are we? I mean, I've been in hotels where they didn't even have a 13th floor. 7 was the perfect number. Peter lays it out. He thinks his hyperbole matches that of the Master. Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. 490. Okay, I've got it. I'm going to put a box on the back of the medicine cabinet door. I'm going to make 490 spots in it. And I'm going to start checking them off. My wife and I, well, last Sabbath, if we had been with you, we would have celebrated our 55th anniversary with you last Sabbath. But thank you. Unfortunately, and fortunately, the August 18 will never be the same again because we were in the hospital with Nathan, terrified for the outcome, which is now beautiful. That's where we were on our 55th anniversary. But on the back of the medicine cabinet, I'm going to have 490 boxes. Every time she does something I don't like, sins against me or whatever, I'm going to check one off. You know, after 55 years, I could probably get pretty close that I don't have to forgive her anymore. Really? Do we catch on to what hyperbole means? That even Peter, who is trying to cast out there a big statement up to 7 times, Jesus says 7 times is ridiculous. Try 490. Or in other words, don't be silly. Don't think in those kinds of human terms. Hyperbole. Then another hyperbole story comes up. King wanted to settle his accounts. Verse 24, he began the settlement, and a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. We don't know what 10,000 talents is. Look down at the bottom, at least it is in my Bible. It says several $1 million. What? There isn't any way I could owe anybody several $1 million. I mean, I don't have that kind of business that I could create a $7 million. I've come to the conclusion that this guy was a bureaucrat. I mean, that's the only way I could owe anybody several $1 million was if I wasted the public money, embezzled it. I don't know what happened here, but this guy, I think, was a bureaucrat, and he had gotten his hand in the till or something like that, and he owed several $1 million. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children be sold and to repay the debt. Servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. Oh, really? You're going to pay back everything? Where's he going to come up with that? The servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and let him go. Wow. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. Well, we don't know what that is either. But if you look at the footnote, it says it's a few dollars. Hyperbole, people. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell on his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay you back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and told the master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled your debt because you begged me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? Hyperbole. Jesus paints the picture of grace and forgiveness in a ridiculously extreme manner to show how loose we are with their money and how tight we are with mine. Forgiveness. Grace. So the disciples finally catch on. Chapter 19, verse 13. Then little children were brought to Jesus to place his hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples rebuked those who brought them. Disciples are a slow, thick-headed bunch. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." Whoever would be great among you, let him become humble like a little child.